Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Wednesday, Yom Revi'i. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Steven in New Hampshire, Yehud in South Carolina, Bella in Florida, Guy in Ohio, Sharon in New Jersey, Joe in the Inland Empire, Shandora in the Bronx, Lucy in Minnesota, Melissa in Great Neck, Sharon. Got the app, but not sure how to connect with live events. I think that a notification goes out when we start the show. But there's also there in the menu on the left, AT Live or AT Daily, something like that. I don't remember just now offhand, but let me just check. There's the notification. There's the menu. Watch. Live stream. So on the left, there's like menus and sub-menus. So you can go to watch, and then you click on that, and you see the sub-menu. And then live stream, and bada bing! There it is. Let me just check. Wait a minute. Let me stop that. There's it. Okay. So it is there. Very House of Mirrors. Anyway, what else is going on? Where was I? I lost my place. Okay. Lucy in Minnesota, Melissa in Great Neck, Sharon got the app, Elvis in New York, Jonathan in SoCal, Bill in Mid-Missouri, prayers of gratitude. My denomination just elected our new presiding bishop for the next 9 years, and it was the candidate I was hoping. Awesome. I imagine that's going to personally affect you and maybe be all for the good, Bill. Bell in Texas, I'm Yisrael Chai, Amen. John in Maine, Mickey's in the house from New Jersey, Capiz in the Philippines, Karen in Northern California. Mickey says YouTube is better. Often is. Often is. And YouTube there, Chaim in Florida, Alice says Shalom, Marjorie in Georgia, Aoife in Florida. Someone mentioned that you can sometimes hear a bit of a buzz in the background. That's my air conditioning. It's just very hot these days. For the most part, I try to have it off during class, but can't always do that if the alternative is to boil in here in the office. Okay, our daf today is page 117 here in Tractate Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. And we are so close. Tomorrow is the Siyum, God willing, on this tractate. So bring a l'chaim. Tomorrow's 118 and 119. Page 119, very short daf. So we should be able to make a l'chaim together, read the hadran at the end, that we read at the end of every tractate, and then open just the very beginning of Bava Basra. So see you tomorrow at the regular time, God willing, 6 p.m. Pacific. Okay. We're picking this up actually well down near the bottom of page 117a with Mishna number 3 here in chapter 10 of Tractate Bava Metzia. Mishnah 3. In the case of the house and the upper story belonging to two different people, right? So it's a duplex, two-family duplex, okay? Different owners own the bottom. It's one family owns the bottom unit, the other family owns the top unit. And the entire house collapsed, right? Both the house and its upper story collapsed. And the owner of the upper story told the owner of the house, by which we mean the lower story, to build the lower story in order to enable the owner of the upper story to rebuild the upper, right? So in other words, probably originally, there was a house that was built, and then that person built an upper story, and then he sold that to someone else as a separate unit, and now there's two different owners. But then the whole thing collapses, and the owner of the upper story says, okay, let's rebuild. And he's telling the owner of the bottom story, rebuild your part, the lower house, and then I will, come along and rebuild the upper story on top of it. But what's the problem? The owner of the lower story can't afford to rebuild, right? So the owner of the upper story told the owner of the lower story to rebuild the lower story so that the owner of the upper story could rebuild his part. And the owner of the lower story does not want to rebuild it. So then the owner of the upper story may build the house, meaning build the lower story, and reside in it until the other one gives him his expenses for the construction of the house, and then he rebuilds the upper story, right? So in other words, the owner of the upper story doesn't have the rights to the lower house. But if the owner of the lower house won't rebuild after the whole thing collapses, then he does have a right to build the lower house and then build the upper house on top of it, or even just build the lower house and live in it. And then when the owner of the lower house says, hey, this is my property, I want to live here. So then the owner of the upper story, who now personally rebuilt the lower story, can say, okay, well, when you pay me the expenses that I laid out to rebuild your house, you can move back in, and then I'll build on top of that. Makes sense. Now, Rabbi Yehuda says, this too, i.e. the owner of the upper story, who is meanwhile residing inside the property of the lower story, since the owner of the lower story couldn't rebuild, that owner of the upper story who builds at the, on the lower level, he has to pay rent, even though he personally laid out the expenses to rebuild the lower house. While he's living in that, he has to pay rent to the owner of the lower property, according to Rabbi Yehuda. And therefore, the solution proposed in the first paragraph of this Mishnah is flawed. So rather, says Rabbi Yehuda, the owner of the upper story builds the house and the upper story, meaning he builds both levels. He completes the entire construction of both levels, and he may then sit in the house, meaning he can live in the lower house until the other one gives him his expenses for rebuilding the lower house, and then he can move into the upper story. And he doesn't have to pay rent, but the reason he doesn't have to pay rent is because he didn't need to live in the lower story. He's perfectly happy to live in the upper story, but he wasn't able to build the upper story until the lower story was built. The owner of the lower story wouldn't rebuild. And so in this case, since he's living in the property of the other guy, and he can do that because he hasn't been reimbursed for his expenses of rebuilding the lower story, he also doesn't have to pay rent. But the reason that he doesn't have to pay rent is because it's not really his choice to live down there. He's only living there, because it's more convenient than walking upstairs, but that's barely a benefit. In other words, since the upper story exists, he'd be perfectly happy to live there. What's interesting is that if he didn't also rebuild the upper story, this resident of the upper story, if he didn't also rebuild the upper story, then it would be a tremendous benefit to him to live in the lower story because he has no other place to live. And because of that, he would have to pay rent. But if it's just a mere convenience because he has his own residence in the upper story to live in, then he doesn't have that same need that is being met by living in the lower story. And that's why he doesn't have to pay rent, according to Rabbi Yehuda. That's Mishnah number 3, and now we're going to talk more about Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Now we're on page 117b. Rabbi Yochanan says, in 3 places, Rabbi Yehuda taught us the principle that it is forbidden for a person to derive benefit from the property of another person without that person's full awareness and consent, even if the owner of the property does not suffer a loss. So one of the places where we are taught this principle is that which we learn in this Mishnah, that Rabbi Yehuda does not allow one to reside in another's property without paying him rent. And what is another place where we are taught this principle from Rabbi Yehuda's statements? As we learned in the Mishna tractate Bava on page 100b, if one gives wool to a dyer to dye it red for him, and instead he dyed it black, and there's a note here that explains it's not so much that you said make it red, and then the dyer just made it black, like a totally different color. Black in this case can mean a darker hue than the customer asked for. It's unacceptable to the customer, but it doesn't have to be so different that it's 2 totally different colors. The bottom line is it's unacceptable to the customer because it's not the hue that he asked for, even though it might be closer, to red than black. It might just be a dark red. But at any rate, he gave wool to a dyer and he didn't get back the dyed wool was not the correct color that the customer asked for. So what happens then? If one gives wool to a dyer to dye it red for him, and instead the dyer dyed it black, or he gave it to the dyer to make it black, and the dyer made it red. So Rabbi Meir says, the dyer gives the owner of the wool the value of his wool. In other words, the dyer purchases the wool, the undyed wool, right? Now he's got dyed wool that he can go and sell for the value of dyed wool, because maybe this isn't the hue that the original customer asked for, but it is dyed wool, which is worth more than undyed wool, and he could sell it to someone. But he can't do that without first purchasing the wool that he took in from the customer. The customer didn't mean to sell it, but since he didn't get what he wanted, he's been made whole by getting the value of his wool, which can now presumably go purchase some wool and take it to some other dyer who will make it correct to his specifications. Right? So Rabbi Yehuda says it's not just so simple as the dyer pays for the wool. Rabbi Yehuda says if the value of the enhancement exceeds the expenses of the dyer that he incurred in coloring the wool and dyeing the wool, then the owner of the wool gives the dyer the expenses that he spent, and if the expenses exceed the enhancement, he gives him the value of the enhancement. But the dyer may not keep the dyed wool for himself, as it is forbidden for one to benefit from another one's property. In other words, the original owner of the wool keeps the wool. He didn't get what he wanted, but he got something of value, so there's going to be a proper discount made for him not getting what he asked for, but he doesn't forfeit the wool, he keeps the wool. And so this is and why? Because Rabbi Yehuda says that you always have to, pay for something that you got, even if it's not what you asked for, but you got something of value. You can't get that free of charge. Now, what is the other third place where we are taught this principle from Rabbi Yehuda's statements? As we learned in the Mishnah in tractate Bava, that's our next tractate, and the longest tractate of the Talmud, and we'll learn this principle on page 168 of Bava. Gives you a sense of how long that tractate is. Now, in a case of a debtor who repaid part of his debt, and he deposited the promissory note with a third party, serving as a trustee to ensure that the creditor not collect the full amount. So this is very interesting. So I borrow money from you, right? So I owe you 100 dinars. Okay, I paid you 50 of it. I still owe you 50. Now, there is a promissory note. Presumably, we're going to record, we would want to record, that I paid you back half of it on that promissory note. But maybe that's not always possible. So what do? What I don't want is that I've paid you 50 and that you still have the promissory note which says that I owe you 100. So I'm not even sure exactly how this is totally going to work. But what happens here is that I who owe get the promissory note back even though I've only paid back, partial repayment. And now what I say is I'm not going to hold the note, you're not going to hold the note, but we're going to give it to a third party, presumably one that we both trust, right? And then I say, okay, I'm going to pay back the rest, and then when I do, okay, so then you give me the promissory note and everything is done. But if I don't pay back the rest, then you can give this note either to the creditor, which would presumably mean that now the creditor will have an instrument that allows him to collect the whole debt, even though he's already collected half the debt. In other words, he could end up collecting the whole debt plus a half, right? So in that situation, we're going to say this is an asmachta because I don't really mean that. I don't want to end up paying more than I owe, right? So when I say that if I don't pay back this thing, you can give him the promissory note, which would give you the ability to collect the whole debt over again, even though I paid half of it already. When I said that, what I meant was I'm going to pay him back right away. Don't worry about it. If I don't, you can give him the whole note. But obviously, I don't mean that because it's not going to happen. It's one of those examples of hyperbole where a person was really just getting this trustee, to take on this job, probably for not getting paid, and say, don't worry, I'm going to pay him. If I don't pay him, you can give him the whole note. But what I mean is, you're not going to have to hold this for very long. I'm going to deal with it, and then life can get in the way. And that's why Rabbi Yehuda is going to say that's not what we're going to do. All right, so let's read that again. So we learned in the Mishna in Bava Basra, in the case of a debtor who repaid part of his debt, and he deposited the promissory note with a third party who is serving as a trustee to ensure that the creditor did not collect the full amount, that he won't collect the full amount again. And the debtor said to the trustee, if I do not give you the balance from now until such and such a time, give the creditor his promissory note, thereby enabling him to collect the full amount stated in the note. So if the stipulated time arrived and the debtor has not given the balance to the trustee, so I'm going to be paying, okay, so he's going to hold the note and I'm going to pay him and he's going to pay you. That's how it's going to work. But if the time comes and I haven't paid the debt, the debtor has not paid the debt, so then Rabbi Yosef says the trustee shall give the promissory note to the creditor, which is what I said he could do, in accordance with the debtor's stipulation. But Rabbi Yehuda says the trustee shall not give it to the creditor, as the stipulation is void. And here too, the reason is that the creditor is forbidden to benefit from the property of another. Meaning get more value out of the promissory note than he deserves, or maybe it's that we turned over the promissory note to the trustee who's personally going to pay and therefore he owns the promissory note. It's a little bit unclear. We're not really going to get fully into the nuances of that case. But let's just keep reading. Alternatively, if one attempts to prove a general principle from the case where one instructed a dyer to dye the wool for him red and he dyed it black, it can be explained that the reason for the ruling of Rabbi Yehuda is due to the fact that the dyer is changing and deviating from, The Gemara, hold on a second, I skipped the paragraph. The Gemara refutes these proofs as to the general applicability of Rabbi Yehuda's rulings. Maybe Rabbi Yehuda rules that you can never benefit from somebody else's property without paying them for it. But these cases don't prove that, says the Gemara. And why is it necessary to say that? Perhaps Rabbi Yehuda is saying this only here with regard to the case of the Mishna concerning a house and its upper story. And that the guy who's rebuilding the lower story so that he can then rebuild his own upper story on top of it, and if he's going to live in the lower story, he has to pay rent until the original owner of the lower story reimburses him for rebuilding the house. well, maybe the reason that Rabbi Yehuda says you have to pay rent is because you're actually depreciating the value of the lower story, right? Because there is blackening of the walls, meaning by using the house, the owner of the upper story causes its walls to blacken, right? In winter, if they're burning a fire indoors, it's going to produce smoke, and the walls won't be brand new like it was when he first built it. By using the house, the owner of the upper story causes its walls to blacken, thereby lowering its value. And yet, he will ultimately claim the value of a new house that he built when he gets his reimbursed for his expenses in building the house. And that's why, since he actually depreciated its value, that he has to pay rent to the owner of that lower property. Alternatively, if one attempts to prove a general principle from the case where one instructed a dyer to dye the wool for him red, and he dyed it black, so it can be explained that the reason for the ruling of Rabbi Yehuda is due to the fact that the dyer is changing and deviating from the owner's instructions. And didn't we learn in the Mishna that whoever changes the terms accepted by both parties is at a disadvantage? And with regard to one who repaid part of his debt, there too, the reason the trustee may not transfer the promissory note back to the creditor is not as explained above. Rather, it is due to the fact that the transfer of the promissory note and the subsequent collection of the entire sum, if the borrower does not repay on time, this is considered a transaction with inconclusive intent, an asmachta, a condition that an individual accepts upon himself as an exaggerated measure that he does not expect to have to fulfill. And we have heard Rabbi Yehuda who says that an asmachta does not effect acquisition. So it's not that somebody was benefiting from somebody else's property without paying for it. It's that there never was a transfer of property because the transfer was only made as an asmachta, and the parties didn't really mean that transfer would be executed. Rav Acha Bar Ada says in the name of Ula, in the name of a resident of the lower story who wishes to rebuild the collapsed house, who comes to change the structure and now seeks to rebuild it with untrimmed stones that are larger than the original ones. So the court listens to him and accepts his wishes, since an adjustment of this kind only serves to benefit the owner of the upper story, because now the lower story will be heavier and more stable. But if the house was previously built with large untrimmed stones, and he now wants to rebuild it with hewn stones, which are smaller, the court does not listen to him, as this reduces the strength of the building. So we're going to just list a few more of these kinds of examples, but the bottom line is, when the house collapses and they're going to rebuild it, so that what should be done is that the house... the owner of the lower house, rebuilds his house exactly the way it was before, and the owner of the upper house rebuilds his part of it exactly as it was before, and then there's no issues. But if either one of them wants to change the way it was built, and that's not so surprising because the old house collapsed, so you would think that they want to rebuild it stronger. So as long as the new plan, right, which is going to vary from the old house, varies in a way that makes the new house stronger, that's going to be permitted, and he's not going to have to get permission for that. But if he's going to make it weaker in any way, he's not going to be allowed to do that. Even if he goes to the court's not going to let him do that. So we see a few more examples. Similarly, if the house that collapsed was formerly built with bricks, and the owner of the lower story wants to rebuild it with girders, so the court listens to him, as this type of wall is very stable. But if the house was previously built with girders and he now wants to rebuild it with bricks, the court does not listen to him. If he wants to roof it with strong cedar wood, the court listens to him. But if he wants to roof it with sycamore wood instead of cedar, the court does not listen to him. If he wants to reduce the number of windows, which would mean less light for him, but more stability for the overall thing, the court listens to him, as this will strengthen the walls. But if he wants to increase the number of windows, the court does not listen to him, because it'll make the structure less stable. If he wants to heighten the building, the court does not listen to him, as it might be less stable than before. But if he wants to reduce its height, then the court listens to him, right? The owner of the lower story, if he's going to accept upon himself to have a lower ceiling, we let him do that. But if he wants to have a higher, more airy ceiling, We don't let him do that because that could make the upper story less stable. Now, the law is the same in reverse. In the case of a resident of the upper story who comes to change the structure and wishes to rebuild the upper story with hewn stones instead of large untrimmed stones, so the court listens to him as this reduces the weight of the upper story pressing down on the lower floor. But if the owner of the upper story wants to rebuild from smaller, wants to change from the smaller hewn stones and rebuild it with larger untrimmed stones, then the court does not listen to him because that will create more weight in the upper story, pressing down on the lower story. And likewise, if the one on the upper story wants to rebuild it with girders instead of bricks, the court does not listen. But if it was previously built with girders and he now wants to rebuild with bricks, the court listens to him because less weight. And if he wants to roof it with heavy cedar wood, the court does not listen to him. But if he wants to roof it with sycamore wood instead of cedar, we listen to him for the same reason. And if he wants to increase the number of windows, which would lessen the weight of the construction of the upper floor, we listen to him. But if he wants to reduce the number of windows, the court does not listen to him, as this increases the weight of the upper story. And if he wants to reduce its height, we listen to him for the same reason, etc. And now the Gemara poses a question. Now we've been talking about if they both are ready to rebuild, great. If one of them only wants to rebuild, okay, then we can let him go forward. He's going to have to be reimbursed by the other if, for example, the owner of the upper story is going to rebuild the lower story. But what happens if the house collapses and both the residents of the lower story and the upper story, they're all too poor to get into a construction project right now and rebuild? Then what? If they are so poor that neither this one nor that one has enough money to rebuild it, and they are prepared to sell the land, what is the law? And the Gemara answers, it is taught in a baraisa, if neither this one nor that one has the money to rebuild the house, the owner of the upper story does not have any rights to the land, and all the rights of the land belong to the owner of the lower story. That is not the law. It is taught in a different baraisa. Rabbi Nassan says, the resident of the lower story takes 2 shares of the land, and the resident of the upper story takes 1/3. That is the halacha. And others say the resident of the lower story takes 3 shares and the resident of the upper story takes 1/4. Rabbah says take the statement of Rabbi Nassan in your hand because he is a judge and he descends to the depths of the law. And he maintains, how much does the presence of the upper story depreciate the value of the house? 1/3. Therefore, he has 1/3, i.e. he's entitled to 1/3 of the total sum that they received for the land, right? So bottom line, if there's a duplex on a piece of land, at least in ancient Israel, and it collapses and they're going to have to sell the land, and then as partners, the owner of the lower story is going to get 2/3 of the purchase price when they sell the land, and the owner of the upper store is going to get 1/3. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 3 here in chapter 10. Now, Mishnah 4. And likewise, in the case of an olive press that is built inside a cave in a rock, and one garden belonging to another person was planted on top of it. So you want to get the picture. There's a nice photo here of exactly what they mean. I guess this was a somewhat common arrangement. All right, so if you could see that, you have a cave, right, sort of built into the side of, a hill a little bit. So the cave contains the olive press, and it's built into the ground. And then there's crops and a garden planted above the ground, and that belongs to the neighbor, right? So you have the olive press in a cave belongs to one guy, and the crops that are planted on top of the land belong to another guy. That's the situation. So then what happens? And the roof of the olive press broke, right? So the cave that has the olive press in it, structurally was not sound, and so that cave collapses. Now what that means is that part of the garden, right, where crops were being grown on that upper level, that's going to collapse also, right? So the guy with the olive press in the cave, he's going to lose the use of his olive press, but that's his property, that's his problem. But the problem is that when his roof collapsed, the person who was planting in the garden above it, they're also going to lose some of their garden. So now what's going to happen? So the roof of the olive press broke, which caused the garden to collapse inward. So in such a case, the owner of the garden may descend and sow, meaning plant seeds and grow them, below until the other one constructs for his olive press sturdy arches to support the roof, so that the owner of the garden can once again sow above him. In other words, the owner of the garden, he's not going to really lose his garden. There's just going to be like a big dip, over the place where the cave with the olive press used to be, but there's going to be dirt there, right? Because it's just going to be lowered, but that dirt is still there, and the guy who has crops there can continue to grow those crops. Now, the guy below, he's gonna need to prop all this stuff up and rebuild his thing. But until he does, the guy with the garden can keep planting on that dirt, even though there's a dip in his garden. Now, the Mishnah continues, in the case of a wall or a tree that fell into the public domain and it caused damage. So the owner is exempt from having to pay, as it was an accident, right? So you have a tree on your property and it fell on the street. Yeah. Pretty much what's really going to happen in the real world, right, is that the city's going to come and clear away that tree. And the guy who owned the tree, he's not going to have to pay for that. That's what happens in the real world. And that jives with this law that we're reading about here in the Mishnah. Right? So he's exempt from having to pay because it was an accident. But if the court saw that the wall was shaky or that the tree was tilting, and they gave him time to cut down the tree or to dismantle the wall, and then the wall or the tree fell down. So if this occurred during the allotted time, they say chop down that tree within 30 days, and if the tree actually fell down after 15 days, well, then he is exempt because the time period had not elapsed. But if they gave him 30 days to chop down the tree and he didn't chop it down, and then his tree fell into the public domain, then he is liable to pay for removing it, since he was warned against this very occurrence. And in the case of one whose wall was adjacent to another person's garden and the wall fell, and the owner of the garden said to him, "Clear away your stones." And the owner of the stones said to him, "Yeah, they're yours. I don't need those stones. I don't feel like clearing them up. They fell into your property, so you can keep my stones. I hereby declare them ownerless, and you can take them for yourself." Well, the court does not listen to him, since he cannot force the other to acquire the stones. They're your stones. They fell into somebody else's garden. It's a pain but for him. You take away your stones. You can't just say, "I don't need the stones, you keep them." It's a real problem for the guy whose garden into whose garden the stones fell. But if after the owner of the garden voluntarily accepted ownership of the stones upon himself, and then the owner of the wall said to him, "You know what, here you are, take your expenditures for the removal of the stones, and I will take back my stones," then the court does not listen to him, as they had already been acquired by the owner of the garden. And so what's interesting is, we say you can't declare your stones ownerless after they fall into your neighbor's yard, and force your neighbor to deal with it. But if you made such a declaration and your neighbor accepted it, then he has acquired ownership of the stones, and you can't say, "Oh, I didn't mean it. I'll pay you for the expenses that you incurred in removing them, but I want my stones back." Then it's too late. So it's interesting that the acquisition doesn't work when it's forced. But if the neighbor accepts it, then the acquisition does work. Now we're on page 118a. And the Mishnah continues, in the case of one who hires a laborer to do work with him, with hay or with straw. And after the worker finished the task, the worker said to the employer, "Give me my wages." Right? So he's asked in a timely way, you have to pay him. Right then and there, right? We learned the day laborer, you have that night to pay him, and after that you have transgressed, do not withhold the wages of a laborer. But he said, the worker said, "Give me my wages." And the employer said to him, "So take what you have worked with as your wages." In other words, he was moving, he was maybe baling straw, right? And so at the end of his day of work, there's a bunch of hay bales. And maybe the value of the hay bales is equivalent to, or the value of some of the hay bales is equivalent to the wage that the worker earned that day. So instead of giving him money, the owner says, okay, so take 2 of the hay bales. That'll be your payment for what you did today. So if he says that, we don't listen to him, right? You can't force the worker to take hay bales instead of money because he was hired for money. He understood that he was going to be making money, not taking home a hay bale. So we don't listen to him. Although debts can be paid with any item of value, even hay or straw, the wages of a laborer must be paid in accordance with the initial agreement between the laborer and the employer. If the laborer understood that he was going to be paid in money, he has to be paid in money. But if after the laborer accepted upon himself to keep the hay or the straw as payment, and the employer changed his mind and said to him, you know what, I don't want to give you a hay bale. Here, take your wages and I will take what is mine. Then the court does not listen to him, right? The laborer has the choice. So he can't be forced to take hay bales as his wage, but if he accepts it, then they become his hay bale, and the owner can no longer take back the hay bale. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. And we are on page 118a. So with regard to the case of the roof of the olive press that was broken, the Gemara cites a dispute with regard to the amount that collapsed. So Rav says most of it must have collapsed, and Shmuel says even a hole of 4 cubits is sufficient for the ruling of the Mishnah to apply. So Rav says most of it must have collapsed, right? So it's this case where there's the olive press in a cave, and then over the cave is somebody else's garden, right? And the roof of the cave collapsed. Well, obviously, if the whole thing collapsed, it's what we said in the Mishnah. But what if it wasn't an entire collapse? Just a hole opened up in the garden that is going to be, I think we're going to talk about 4 cubits by 4 cubits, so about a 6 foot by 6 foot hole. Is that the same as the entire roof collapsing? Let's see. Right, so most of it must, so Rav says most of it has to have collapsed for this law to kick in, and Shmuel says even a hole of 4 cubits is sufficient for the ruling of the Mishnah to apply. Rav says most of it must have collapsed. But if it is only a hole of 4 cubits, there is no basis for a claim, since a person can sow partially on a level below and partially on a level above. And Shmuel says it is enough if a hole of 4 cubits, as a person cannot sow partially on a level below and partially on a level above. That is very annoying, so he's going to have a claim that he can make against the guy whose unsturdy cave containing his olive press collapsed. Now, this should sound familiar because we saw this where there was the resident of the upper story and the resident of the lower story, and a hole, and actually there it was the landlord lived in the lower story, the tenant lived in the upper story, and then a hole opens up in the ceiling or in the floor of the upper story. And does the owner of the upper story have a claim? In fact, a claim that's so strong that he can go and live downstairs until the landlord fixes the floor. And we talked about they had the same disagreement between Rav and Shmuel, that only if most of the floor collapses can he go live downstairs. And the others said, no, if there's a hole, that's even, I think, 1 cubit, then he has this claim. But that's in a residence. So the Gemara comments, and it is necessary for this dispute between Rav and Shmuel to be stated both here with regard to the garden over the olive press cave and with regard to that case of the upper story that collapsed, what we talked about already, as had the Gemara taught us only that they disagree with regard to a residence. One could have said it is only in this case that Shmuel is saying his ruling because people do not tend to live a little here and a little there. He doesn't want to, keep stuff downstairs and upstairs and have to go downstairs into somebody else's house every time he needs this piece of furniture that formerly stood where there's now a hole in the floor, because that's very annoying within a residence. But here, with regard to sowing in a garden, people do tend to sow a little here and a little there. Therefore, one might say that that Shmuel concedes to Rav in the case of the olive press. And if this dispute were stated only with regard to this case of the olive press, one could have said that it is only with regard to this case that Rav is saying his opinion, but with regard to that case involving the house, one might say that he concedes to Shmuel, and therefore it was necessary to state both cases because even though the ruling is basically the same, the conditions are different. New subject, the Mishnah taught. if the court saw that the wall was shaky or that the tree was tilting, right? So they warned this. So if your tree falls into the street or your wall falls out into the public domain, it's an accident. You're not liable to remove all your stuff from the public domain. You should help, but the town will be responsible. But if you were warned that your wall was shaky or that your tree was tilting and that it is a public hazard, and if they told you you need to remove that, you have 30 days to do it, and you don't do so, and then after the 30 days it collapses into the street, then you are liable. The Mishna teaches, in the case of one whose wall was located, the Mishna taught if the court saw the wall was shaky or that the tree was tilting and they gave him time to cut down the tree or to dismantle the wall and then they fell down, if this occurred during the allotted time, he is exempt. But if they collapse after the time given to him had elapsed, he is liable to pay. And so now the Gemara asks, and how much time will the court usually allot for this purpose? Spoiler alert, I already told you. Rabbi Yochanan says the standard period is 30 days. New subject. The Mishnah taught, in the case of one whose wall was located next to his friend's garden and the wall fell, if the owner of the wall told the owner of the garden to keep the stones, he can't force the owner of the garden to keep the stones, but this guy who said keep the stones, he cannot retract, right? Meaning the owner of the garden says, okay, I'll take the stones. The owner of the wall cannot retract his offer. So the Gemara comments, but from the fact that the last clause of the Mishnah teaches that if the owner of the fallen wall says, here you are, take your expenditures, the court does not listen to him, well, then it can be understood by inference that we are dealing with a case where the owner of the garden cleared away the stones. It can therefore be deduced that the reason the owner of the fallen wall cannot retract his offer is that the owner of the garden cleared them away. But if he did not clear them away, the stones are not considered his and they remain in the possession of the owner of the wall, right? Meaning if the guy says, my wall falls into your yard and I don't feel like cleaning it up, and I say, you know what, keep the stones. So for sure, if you then clear away the stones and I say, you know what, I changed my mind. I'll pay you for whatever cost you incurred clearing away the stones, but I want my stones back. Too late, I'm out of luck. But if I say, you know what, I don't want to clean them up, keep the stones, right? And you say, okay, I'll keep the stones. And then you haven't done anything, but I come back the next day and I say, you know what, I changed my mind. I want to keep my stones and rebuild my wall. Can I retract? Now that you haven't taken any action, you haven't relied on my statement to your detriment, did we actually form a contract? So let's see. The Gemara asks, why did they remain in the possession of the owner of the wall? But shouldn't the owner of the garden's field effect acquisition of the stones on his behalf? In other words, now that they fell into your garden and you say, okay, I'll keep the stones, isn't that a kinyan? Right, and a formal act of acquisition. Why? Because the stones are in your yard, and your yard, your courtyard, effected acquisition for you. That's what the Gemara is asking. As Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Hanina, says, the courtyard of a person effects acquisition for him of those items that enter into it, even without his knowledge. And the Gemara answers, this statement applies only in a case where the giver intends to transfer them to him, in which case the field can effect acquisition of the stones for the receiver without any additional act of acquisition. But here, the owner of the fallen wall is seeking only to evade the owner of the garden. He wants the owner of the garden to take care of the stones, at which point he can collect them from him without much effort on his part. And he does not intend to give the stones to him, and that's why we're not going to say that the courtyard effected acquisition. I never intended it. So does my, gaming the system actually work to my benefit because your courtyard didn't affect acquisition for you because I never really intended to give it to you? Sounds like, yeah. But it's not so much because we gamed the system. It's that they were my stones. It should be on me to clean them up. And if I'm going to go through and do the right thing, then I'm going to be allowed to go ahead and do the right thing. But if I say you can keep them and then you collect them, then I'm out of luck. You collected the stones and they now belong to you. Okay, now the Gemara asks, but what? Yes, the Mishnah teaches, in the case of one who hires a laborer to do work with him with hay, right? So I hired the guy to bale my hay, and then he understood that I was going to pay him money for the work that he did that day. And at the end of the day, I say, you know what? I don't have money, but take one of the hay bales. That's worth as much as your wages. Take that. I cannot force him to accept that. He's expecting money. He can be paid money. He can demand money. But if I say take the bale of hay as your wage, and he says, okay, fine, I'll take the hay bale, I can't change my mind because he has effected acquisition. So, in the case of one who hires a laborer to work with him with hay, the employer cannot force him to accept his wages in the form of some of the hay. And the Gemara comments, and it is necessary to mention this law with regard to both cases, right? The stones and the wages. As had it taught us only with regard to the first case of the stones that fell when the owner of the fallen wall says to the owner of the garden, they are yours, that the court does not listen to him, one might have said that this is the law because he does not have a wage owed to him, right? The neighbor doesn't have anything owed to him, as they had no prior business dealings together, and the owner of the stones does not owe the owner of the garden anything. But here, in the case of a laborer working with hay, in which the laborer does have a wage owed by the employer, one might say that the court listens to him. As people say the following proverb, when collecting a debt from your debtor, allow yourself to be repaid, even in bran, i.e. take whatever you can as payment of the loan, so at least the employer is paying something. We might have said that it should be accepted, but no, we don't force the worker to take it. I'm so close to done. I should have warned you sooner. So if you have questions or comments, please get them in now. And had it taught us only over here with regard to the hay, one would have said that it is only here after the laborer has already accepted ownership upon himself that the court does not listen to the employer who desires to retract because the laborer has a wage that is owed to him. And therefore, there is reason to say that it receives the hay and that the owner cannot retract. But here, with regard to the stones, where the owner of the garden does not have a wage owed by the owner of the fallen wall, one might say that the court listens to the owner of the wall, and he can retract. It is therefore necessary for the Mishnah to teach both cases. In other words, one case has an underlying debt between the two parties, the other doesn't. In both cases, we have the same law working, but it needed to be stated in both cases because the underlying condition of the cases is different. Okay. So that's where we'll stop. And tomorrow we'll do a double daf. But we've already done a lot of 118, and 119 is very short. So it's not going to be like a long class. But we will have a siyum on tractate Bava Metzia tomorrow, God willing. So bring a l'chaim to help us celebrate. And perhaps think about something you learned from this tractate that you'd like to take away with you. And perhaps share it with the class, and we can read some of those comments at the end of class tomorrow. Okay, on today's page, Bill. So does this mean that if the owner of the lower house doesn't want to rebuild and simply wants to move, the owner of the upper house just takes possession of the lower house? I would say no, and you probably asked that before we got to the latter part of the discussion, where if they can't afford to rebuild and they're going to sell, who gets what? Right? So if the owner of the lower house just wants to leave, he is owed, 2/3 of the value of the property. He's going to have to be reimbursed for that. But that's going to be offset by the amount of expenses that the owner of the upper story put into rebuilding the lower story. So those will be offsetting expenses. Joe, they sell the land and divide the proceeds. What about selling the rocks as building materials? So that we just sort of talked about that the day before, right? So if they're going to get to keep the rocks, right? So if we can separate and identify whose rocks are whose, we do. Otherwise, they're going to split it, right? And that's for them to rebuild. But if they're not going to rebuild, if they're going to sell it because they're so poor, then how are we going to divide the value? I think it's going to be according to the same principles as when we were saying who gets to keep the rocks. Elvis, if the owner of the upper floor has the means to rebuild both floors, but the owner of the ground floor does not have the ability to pay for his share, how would the debt terms be for the owner of the ground floor? So I think that it's what it said, right? So he's out. He has to go find some other place to live. The one who rebuilds the lower floor he's going to actually have to, if he just only rebuilds the lower floor, he's going to actually owe rent. But that's going to be offset by the amount that he put in to rebuild that lower house. If he rebuilds both the lower floor and the upper floor, then he doesn't have to pay rent. And he can keep living in that lower floor until the previous owner of the lower floor can reimburse what the owner of the upper floor put into rebuilding that lower floor. Sharon, I am living this daf right now. A tree was on our property next to a brook between us and our neighbors. In the storm on Saturday evening here, the brook rose. Good Lord willing and the creek don't rise. I think that's a saying. So the creek rose dramatically and uprooted the tree, and it fell across and blocked the road. So our town did remove the tree, but the cut up tree in our yard, but they cut up the tree in our yard, and they say we are responsible to further remove the tree, not the town to do that. So how would our daf adjudicate the responsibility here? So I think what we have to add, that we didn't say today, but it was in the notes, is that in all these cases, right, building codes, division of labor, hiring, there's going to be deference paid to local custom. So, and dina de malchusa dina, right? So the law of the land is the land. The law of the land is the law. So we're going to have to respect the laws of your town, assuming that it is not a corrupt town government that is imposing this on you without, outside of what the actual law is. So let's put all that aside and say, well, what if you were living in a Talmudic time, and the Torah, and the law is according to Torah within the land. So then what? So you were not warned, right? You were not warned that you needed to remove that tree. Therefore, it's an accident. The town came along and left it on your land. Now, you're going to have a problem, right? Which is that, what are you seeking to do? You're seeking to extract payment from the town for you to remove the cut tree. Now, they might say to you, Sharon, what are you talking about? This is wonderful firewood, and you got the benefit of keeping the firewood on your land. So you'll be able to burn it next winter. But you're saying, yeah, no, we don't do that. That's not good wood for burning, whatever. It's not worth it to me. I want it gone. And it's the town's responsibility to remove it. But, you have to prove that they have that responsibility. And I don't know if we established that clearly enough from what we read, right? Maybe you're not liable to remove it when it's lying in the street, but does that mean that when it's been cut and stacked on your property that you have, the power to extract funds from them for getting rid of it? I don't know. Unclear. But you are definitely living the daf and the machloket that might ensue. And finally, Elvis, what if the owner of stones from a fallen wall gives them to me, but he then later has second thoughts and he asks for retention of ownership? Would it not be a mitzvah if I were to voluntarily agree to this because I want to promote friendly neighborly relations despite the law being on my side to keep them? I would say yes, definitely. And I think probably you would do that. I think the question would come, he said keep them. You say, okay, fine, I'll take them. And then you did something with them, right? You said, you know what, this is a nice opportunity. I'm going to build a little clubhouse for my kids with the stones that fell over and are here. And so you invested some time and effort and money to do that. And then he wants his stones back. You're going to be like, hey, I relied on your statement that I could keep them and I invested and now I'm not going to give it back to you. But if they were still lying there and you said you were going to keep them, and maybe you even stacked them, so you did something with them to take formal acquisition of them, so it's up to you. But if you were going to be neighborly and give them back, then wonderful. I think that's a wonderful thing to do, and certainly there would be no dispute from the court. It's very good that you and your neighbor settled it that way. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Thursday, regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, to finish this tractate and make a celebratory see you. Good night.